Good afternoon. Today, I am honored to be part of a Montana State University collaborative Prelude and Performance event. As the title implies, we'll be treated to an introduction to the work of two very talented musicians and an in-depth understanding or unveiling of the works of Shostakovich. I am Bobby Geis. I'm the director of Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at MSU. It's a program of academic technology and outreach. Together with the MSU School of Music and the Alumni Foundation, we are excited to welcome students, parents, faculty, staff, and OLLI members alike to enjoy today's Prelude and Performance, Shostakovich Unveiled. But before we begin our interactive narrative and sharing of recorded performance clips, I invite you to explore the different screen view and volume control options at the bottom of your YouTube video screen. And as with all OLLI at Prelude and Performance events, we encourage audience participation. In this case, it will be via chat, and that function is adjacent to your viewing screen. You can type and send by pressing the return key your questions and comments in the chat, and they'll be moderated and shared with our performers today, and some will be answered directly within the chat itself. Joining us later will be Michaela Bader of the Alumni Foundation, but now I would like to turn it over to Professor of Music and Cade's teacher, Angela Ahn. Thank you again for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to introduce Cade Fitteman, who is my violin student, and we at School of Music are so proud of Cade. He's a double major in music and engineering and has so many accomplishments that I can't actually list all of them right now, but I'm sure you're going to be excited to hear him. Supporting Cade will be Lori Rosolowski, a musician, a pianist, a producer, a singer-songwriter, founder of Open Sky Artists, and we're just so thrilled that she is in our community and able to support our students. So without further ado, Cade Fitteman and Lori Rosolowski. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Angela. So today we're going to be bringing you Shostakovich's Violin Concerto No. 1 in A minor. So unfortunately, we don't have time to play the entire concerto because it's like 40 minutes long or so. So we're just going to focus on the second movement out of 4, which is a Scherzo. So we've been working on this for, I think, 6 months now, and we've been performing it all over for competitions and concerts and a bunch of other stuff.
So in full disclosure, when I got the opportunity to join Cade on this journey and hear this piece for the first time, it sounded incomprehensible to me, like a foreign language, people yelling in a foreign language. And the journey to get to know and appreciate this, like understanding key phrases in a language, is what excites us so much to share this with you. And so to begin the program, we're going to turn to a clip of a recording of the first 30 seconds of the piece.
So this piece was written by the Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich. So this was written just after World War II, and at this point in time, Russia was under Stalin's rule, and times were pretty chaotic and frightening for Shostakovich. So I think you can hear a lot of that in the clip that we just played, and it really only gets more noticeable as we go on.
Now this work, it's a concerto, meaning it was written for a solo instrument and an orchestra. But you can imagine it's completely impractical to have a soloist rehearse with an orchestra for hours and hours, not to say months and months. So what happens is the orchestral parts get consolidated into a piano score, which technically a pianist is supposed to play, or at least try. And that collaboration is why the role that I have in this is called a collaborative pianist. Some people used to use the term accompanist. But that collaborative journey is true in every sense of the word, because we've made musical decisions together, we've made discoveries together, we've made mistakes together, and we've made some really good music together. And so that's how our partnership has begun, and how we started from an initial mystery to the current stage of mastery that we're at, and we have much more to learn. So let's dive into what makes this piece great.
So the bulk of this concerto is written from really only a few pieces of thematic material. So the first of these does not actually occur in the violin part, but actually is taken up by the orchestra. So this is then handed off to the violin shortly after, pretty much in the exact same form. So rather than simply reusing it throughout the concerto, he continually modifies it and uses it in different ways. So here it is in a slightly distorted version. And he also transposes it to different keys. And chops it up and gives it new endings or other bits of material in it.
And sometimes we just hear the first three notes of it repeated 3 times in a row.
So if you'll notice that this doesn't quite sound like a lot of the themes that we're used to hearing from other pieces of classical music, and also like a lot of the music you kind of hear every day, like the pop and rock and kind of popular music. So the reason for this is that most of the music we typically hear is based off of these major and minor keys or scales. So here's a major and minor. So this piece just really doesn't fit into that. And so that lends it this really quirky feel, and it also creates tons of opportunities for new harmonies and places it can go, and also adds a lot of like potential dissonance and clash that he can use. So to give you some historical background, Shostakovich was born in Russia at the very start of the 20th century. So he achieved fame from a very early age. I believe he wrote his first symphony when he was only 19 years old. Wish I could do that. So by the time Stalin was in power and this piece was written, he was a very prominent public figure and then, of course, Stalin didn't like this because Stalin really wanted absolute power. And so in order to demonstrate that no one was above his scrutiny, he targeted Shostakovich. So at this point, Shostakovich was basically alternating between being a public hero and then being denounced as an enemy of the people. And as you can imagine, under Stalin in Russia, being an enemy of the people had pretty dire consequences, and a lot of his friends and family actually were forced to denounce him in order to stay alive. So to keep himself safe, he knew that Stalin was not going to like this piece. And so this was actually written in secret, and it was kept that way for roughly 9 years until after Stalin had died and things had become a little more settled down.
So what do artists do when they can't express themselves freely? Well, in the case of Shostakovich and this work, he composed a musical monogram, if you will, a series of 4 musical notes whose letters spelled some of the initials of his name. So the notes are D for Dmitri and SCH for Shostakovich. And in the musical alphabet that we who read notes in English are familiar with, those notes are D, E flat, C, B. D flat, C, B. And that is known as the Shostakovich Motive. So the thing is, he doesn't just declare it so everybody can figure it out. Instead, because he is doing this secretively, under protest, he disguises it in a million ways, ways that are really hard to find. Kind of like the Where's Waldo, where you discover there's something to look for, and then once you know it exists, you look for it everywhere, and that's what Cade and I have done. So the point of that, the musical meaning behind that we interpret, is that Shostakovich is speaking about his individual identity in a surreptitious way so he will not be caught by the regime that is controlling his life and fate.
So what's really interesting, so this motive was used most famously in his Chamber Symphony, which he wrote as a sort of autobiography. What I find really fascinating is that this piece that we're playing for you today might actually be the first time that he ever used it, although it's not exactly known because this was kept secret for so long that we don't quite know when this movement was written. So I think we'll play our next clip. Interestingly enough, the Shostakovich motive only occurs a handful of times, basically right at the very end of the piece. So here it is in a prominent position in the violin line. So it also occurs a few times in the orchestra, but really all right at the end. So although it doesn't occur in its exact format, it is set up for the listener early on in the piece. So here's a version with one note change that shows up much earlier, as opposed to the exact version, which would be like this. And something that we discovered after way too long is that he's really built in all the pitches that he needs for this right in the opening melody.
If you take the first 4 notes of the main theme in the orchestral part, if you slow them down, and if you change the order, you get that Shostakovich motive. And the amazing thing is that Cade and I, after collectively spending hundreds of hours on this piece, only realized that many hours into this journey. And it just goes to show how many more discoveries there are to be made.
So I think, although he's not necessarily, in the very opening, he's not necessarily using it as the motive, but what he's done is he's taken all the intervals that he needs to use that, and then he's built that into the melody. So that way we can already, although we can't pick it out from the melody, it gets in our ear so that we're prepared for it when he says it explicitly later on. So now that we have a bit more basis for what's going on in the opening, I'm going to show you a bit of what's going on in the violin part. So while the orchestra is playing its melody, the violin has this second theme that's playing a counter melody to the orchestra. So then these two together sound like this. So it's definitely very frantic, frenetic, and it's off edge, but it's also it's kind of dance-like. And violinist David Oistrakh described this as a demonic dance, which I think sums it up well. But quite surprisingly, this theme turns up again shortly after, only this time it's even more intense and frenetic. So here it is in the violin part a little later. So the rhythm is changed and there's some extra notes added in, but the basic theme is still the same. And what I found really interesting is that underneath that, the orchestra is playing a version of the beginning theme.
So now if we take the first 10 notes of the opening theme, if we slow them down and straighten out the rhythm, and then if we take the whole thing down to a lower register and thicken it up with some extra notes, that's the transformation of the opening theme in this section of the piece.
So then together, these are played together. So what I find really interesting is that instead of being the melody and the accompaniment, it's now, we've swapped roles so that that second theme is now the main melody, while the original theme has been converted into playing accompaniment. And as I'm sure you heard, these parts, instead of working together like they did at the opening, there's much more tension and there's much more clash. And so it's almost kind of an adversarial feel. And I think this increase in tension is really kind of indicative of what Shostakovich was feeling or going through at the time.
And of course, the melody, now we're in 2/4 time, not a fast one, and so now we're feeling a march, and we're really leading towards this militaristic portion of the movement.
So Stalin kept Russia under an iron fist. So unfortunately for the rest of us, he didn't really appreciate art in any sense. So Shostakovich, along with many of his contemporaries, were forced to write exclusively patriotic music and songs that basically upheld the might of the Russian military and how idyllic and prosperous and great everything was going to be under Stalin. And that was all they could write. Anyone who disagreed, or really anyone Stalin didn't like, was taken by the KGBs and never heard from again. So Shostakovich was keeping himself alive by writing patriotic music for movies and other stuff like that. This didn't really satisfy him intellectually, and what he did is he inserted things into his music that were kind of mocking what he was writing as he was writing it. So he just was very subtle about it and interjected these little quotes or mocking little phrases that just kind of made fun of the regime and of the overly positive, overly bombastic things that he was forced to write. And then I think we'll do the next clip. So after we've had this kind of first theme for quite a while and various versions of that, we now have the second major piece of thematic material, which is really builds up the rest of the entire piece. And so this is much more of a militaristic march sort of theme. And it's first taken up in the orchestra.
You can hear how grotesque it is, how absurd it is. It's really clear that Shostakovich at this point is satirizing the world in which he lives.
So what's really interesting to me is that this is the first time that I'm not playing anything for a substantial point of time. I mean, the orchestra has had the melody before, but I've always been accompaniment and playing, or accompanying it and playing a prominent role. So I think what this represents to me is kind of the takeover of the regime and the military march that's come in and imposed itself on the music and kind of excluded the violin. So shortly after the orchestra has had its solo, then the violin joins in, playing the same theme, but with the orchestra playing something underneath. So what's one of the things that really struck me about this is that underneath this melody in the violin part, there's this really kind of out of place, almost circusy theme or circusy accompaniment that's just going kind of oompa right in the orchestra part. So this struck me as almost, it's kind of amusingly out of place in kind of a dark humor sort of way. So I think what he's really doing is he's being sarcastic and really mocking the overly bombastic military music he was being forced to write by kind of introducing this like circusy feel to it. So now that we've had this big climax with the takeover of the military theme, then things relax for a bit. So we have the opening melody, which returns again, and this time both parts are played in the violin, but it's overall really much more relaxed. So it's much more relaxed, it's quite playful, and so this really creates kind of a release from the big buildup of tension that we had previously. So obviously this doesn't last for long, and we get maybe a minute, and then it starts building back up, and it just builds and builds and builds. And then we have the finale where the military theme comes in again in an upper register of the violin part. And this time it's almost even more sarcastic and circusy. So this is also where we get the Shostakovich theme that I mentioned earlier, or the Shostakovich Motive. First in the orchestra part. So this happens a couple times in quick succession, and then we also have the spot I mentioned earlier where it occurs in the violin. So after this, the violin transitions to playing these intense, piercing, repeated notes that's really just drilling into you all the way, pushing towards the end of the movement. And so I think in my mind what this represents is kind of it's like there's no longer any hope of escape, and it's just drilling into you, and it's like insanity has just finally set in.
So before we play a recording of the entire work, including the finale, I've got to share a funny story with you that reflects something that happened really early in our collaboration together. I was given the music 2 or 3 weeks before we needed to play it for a student recital right here. And to say it was You've just heard a recording of the Scherzo that Cade and I recorded for one of his competitions. All of his competitions have been very successful, and this was one that we did for the Montana Association of Symphony Orchestras competition. And the rules of it were that you couldn't have multiple cameras like you're seeing today in the recorded clips, and we didn't have the wonderful tech team that has supported this event today. But nonetheless, it represents an excellent performance that we had. But I've got to tell you how this whole journey began, which is that I got the music about 2 or 3 weeks before we needed to do it for a student recital here at MSU. And that was pretty scary, like training for a marathon on 3 weeks' notice. And I discovered that I have this bear playing piano. I got it in the Soviet Union in 1983 when I visited. And I would say that this is about how I felt back the first time we performed the piece, but we've come a long way.
That piano part is really hard, by the way. It's like the entire orchestra is just with 2 hands to use.
Exactly. And so, but the most exciting thing is that we are not done. You never master a work like this, and there are 2 more movements in the piece that we haven't learned, and so we have a lot of stuff that we get to do together. But it's been really fun for us to share a snippet of our experience in the last several months with you, and hopefully when you get a chance to hear Cade play it with an orchestra, you will really appreciate some of the musical elements as well as his expertise that you might not have had you not participated in today's event. And speaking of today's event, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the incredible commitment by a whole slew of people at MSU. It takes a village, it takes an army. We have the School of Music led by Dr. Jason Bolte. We have the tech department led by Jeremiah Slovarp, and we've had so much FaceTime with Thomas and his team. We've got MSU, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute led by Bobby Geis, who you met at the beginning of the program. We've got, of course, the incredible tutelage of Angela Ahn. And let's see, we've got the MSU Alumni Foundation. And the key people who've supported us in this journey are Vice President of Alumni Engagement, Carrie Hansen, her Assistant Director, Naomi Schott, and also Michaela Bader, who leads the development efforts that allow funding to come into the university to support programs like this. So I hope I haven't missed anyone. There's so many people who made this possible, and I'm really grateful.
So I just want to add a huge thank you to Angela Ahn, because she has spent an immense amount of time and effort like helping me learn this piece, and I just couldn't have done it without her. And then also to Lori over here, because she has done an amazing job with the incredibly difficult piano part. And we've also just had a lot of fun with this. So I hope you enjoyed the recording, and I think it's time for Q&A.
Wow, thank you all for joining us today for this outstanding performance. My name is Michaela Bader. I'm a Director of Development at the MSU Alumni Foundation. Thank you again to all the collaborators in today's event, the School of Music, Ollie, the MSU Alumni Foundation, and Open Sky Artists. A huge thank you to Lori and her company, Open Sky Artists, for providing a $1,000 match to support the Magic 88 Fund. If you have questions or are interested in learning more information about supporting Montana State collaborative piano or other opportunities, please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you so much again for joining us, and I'll pass it on to Q&A. Please make sure to put your questions in the chat. Thank you.
We have a question. What do you do to warm up?
Okay, so we've got a question on what do we do to warm up. So I don't know, I like to start off and just like do open strings. Well, actually first, like have a banana half an hour before a performance. I'm not sure why it helps, but it does. Then I just do open strings, some scales, and then go super slowly through the stuff I'm going to play, in particular all the hard spots. So I don't want to wear myself out doing runs or anything, but just going slowly, cleaning everything up, and so which gets my fingers into it so that when the performance comes, it's much more comfortable and I don't have to think about it. So what about you, Lori?
I'm not as disciplined as I should be about warming up, but when Kate and I would warm up in rehearsal together, we used that metronome like crazy. And we just put it on a slow tempo and worked through the difficult passages over and over until we could get up to the 90 miles an hour that that Shostakovich insisted it be played out.
We have a question. What else have you played together?
So we have a question on what else we've played together. So actually this piece was our first time working together. So we've played this movement, and then we also played the first movement together.
And the next question is, what did learning the whole history of the piece add to your performance?
So another question on what did learning the history add to the performance? So I think with this piece in particular, there's so much history and political background that's going on with this that learning all of what was going on really helped me to get kind of inside what was going on in Shostakovich's head while he was writing that. And really, that brought a whole new element to my performance because, like, before, like, there's a lot of notes, and if I'm just focusing on the notes, it's not necessarily a very interesting performance. But if I can really get into where Shostakovich was coming from, where he wrote it, I find that that really helps me bring out certain elements that I want to bring out, like the militaristic theme or the DSCH motive. And then it also just helps me get the emotions that are in behind it.
Yeah, and I'd say that when people have a chance to hear the entire violin concerto and hear the different movements, you will appreciate the immense agony that Shostakovich must have been in when he wrote this piece. And so although we've only been able to share with you one of the movements, understanding why he had to write this piece, and anyone who's a musician or a creator of any kind understands that inescapable need to create, especially under hard times.
What is the time signature? Does it change a lot?
So we have a question on the time signature. So the piece starts off in 3/8, but it's going at 120 to the dotted quarter note, so it's pretty much in 1 with about 2 measures a second. And then a little later on, it switches to 2/4, so it's a little more like a march. So I think we mentioned that earlier, so I think, and then after that, where we get the return, after the militaristic theme, when we have the return of the opening, it switches back to that 1 feel. And then that goes for a while, and then we switch back to 2/4 to the end, and then 3/8 at the very for the finale. So it switches back and forth quite a bit.
How do you stop yourself from getting stuck in the analysis of the piece while you're performing it?
Okay, so we have a question, how do we keep ourselves from getting stuck in the analysis of the piece while we're performing it? I think with this piece especially, it goes by so fast that basically the entire thing is muscle memory. So while I'm practicing and stuff, I'll spend quite a lot of time getting it analyzed, knowing exactly what I want to play. But then when the time comes and like step up on stage, then it's really just like I don't really have time to think of anything, and it's just fully automatic playing it as it comes.
I'll add to that, as I said at the outset, listening to something like this and learning something like this is like learning a foreign language. And so at the beginning, it just sounded like a whole bunch of people saying stuff in a language at 100 miles an hour, and I didn't understand anything. As we worked together and got to dive deep inside the piece, it got to the point where I could hear what he was saying. I understood what I was saying. Sometimes the piano part has multiple conversations going on. And so it got to the point where I felt fluent enough in this medium as if I could hear 3 conversations going on at the same time. And that said, it was all musical. I wasn't analyzing it, I was just hearing it. And I wasn't getting stuck in the analysis of it.
What drew you to this piece specifically, and what part of the experience of playing it do you feel will be most valuable to your music moving forward?
Okay, so we have another question on what drew us to the piece, and also what part of that we feel is going to be most valuable going forwards, right? So Angela actually recommended the piece to me, and I listened to it on YouTube. There's a great recording by Hilary Hahn, and pretty much from that, I was like, I have to play this. And I think what I really love about the piece is there's just such a huge depth of emotion, and it's also like very different from a lot of the repertoire we tend to play that's more like romantic music or classical. And so there's just so much going on that it's really fun to listen to and really fun to play. And then, want to add anything onto that?
You know, if someone asks me to play piano with them, and if it's Cade, I'll do anything.
And then what part of that do we feel is going to be most valuable going forwards? I think one of the things I really liked was having all this depth of the historical background that we've been bringing to you today, especially Shostakovich. There is such a rich history behind it that I really love bringing those elements into my playing. And then I also think what I really love was working together, because this part it's so complicated and difficult. But there's also so much that can be accomplished by performing together and really collaborating there. So I think that was one of the things that I really enjoyed, is this massive collaborative aspect.
Yep.
Is it universally understood that Shostakovich was mocking the military with the march?
So we have a question on, is it universally understood that Shostakovich was mocking the military march? So the answer to that is definitely not. So I think it's not just in this, that's kind of the march that we showed to you today is certainly more our interpretation. There are, in a lot of his other pieces, there are examples of that I think are potentially even more visible, like his 9th Symphony was commissioned by Stalin to be the most patriotic, most gigantic, most Russian symphony ever, and he starts it off with this like kind of goofy little like toy soldier march theme, which got him in a ton of trouble. I think in my mind, there's very little doubt that he was mocking the stuff he was writing. But that being said, it's not universally accepted. There was, shortly after Stalin died, there was a letter. Sorry, I'm tripping here. But there was an American company published a report on basically saying that Shostakovich was a staunch supporter of Stalin and all of that. And I don't think there was much merit to it, but it's certainly a possibility that he was there and he was really self-criticizing himself and that he was really doing his best to support the regime. I just don't believe that that's the case.
We just have a couple minutes left, but Lori, what do you feel are the benefits of being a collaborative performer? Then follow up, Cade, how is your professional relationship with Lori different than playing with an orchestra, for example?
And the question for me was the benefits, sorry.
What do you feel are the benefits of being a collaborative performer?
Thank you. So the question is, what do I feel are the benefits of being a collaborative performer? Well, as a musician and as a pianist, which is a solo instrument, I don't have the same opportunity as other players growing up or in my professional life to play with ensembles. And there's nothing that is more fun than collaborating with other people and then sharing it with audiences such as yourselves. And so to get the opportunity to dive into an exceedingly challenging and interesting work is fun, to say the least, fascinating, and to forge new professional and personal bonds can't be underestimated. So it's definitely one of my very favorite ways to make music.
So then adding on to that, the question is like, what's different between playing with an orchestra and then playing with a collaborative pianist like Lori? So I've only played with an orchestra. I have not played this piece with an orchestra, but I have performed the Mendelssohn, or part of the Mendelssohn Concerto and then a Baroque one. So I think what's really different is that when I'm playing with someone with like Lori who's on piano, there's much more room for collaborating together, working together, and like learning the piece together. Kind of when you do something with an orchestra, the orchestra learns the orchestra part, soloist learns the solo part, then you come together for a couple rehearsals, put everything together. But what's really different with working together with Lori is that we've really put the piece together as like a unit. So when we both started rehearsing, neither of us could really play the piece particularly well. And we've really spent 6 months just stitching everything together and learning it together.
Lori, Cade, thank you so much for this fabulous performance. Shostakovich Unveiled. My personal learning experience has exceeded my expectations, as I hope would be the same for all the students that are attending, and OLLI members and alumni and everyone else who's had the opportunity to visit this and view this live and recorded. So go Cats, go forward, and keep playing music. Thank you, everybody.